This is Chapter 5, Enlightenment and Revolution, Discussion Number 1, Famous Thinkers of the Enlightenment Period. A continuation of the philosophical thought of the humanist period that we talked about in Chapter 1 is the idea of the Enlightenment. We're going to start with the Enlightenment with the concept of what people know as natural law. Remember that as the Renaissance and the Reformation were going, that we have an existence where people start using thought and logic in order to determine where truth is. And through this, they had discovered that there is natural law. Now, natural law exists, first of all, in the physical world, where if you drop something, natural law says that gravity will pull it down toward the larger mass, thus things fall down. Natural law means that if you have a positive magnet, it's going to attract itself to a negative magnet. But what if there is not just laws on the physical existence of nature? What if there's natural laws to human behavior and society? And so a lot of the Enlightenment period that we're going to see starts at about the 1600s and starts going through pretty much 1800 is a movement toward understanding how is the best way that society exists. And while we're going to be talking about the Enlightenment, we're going to be hitting several different authors and different thinkers during the time period. And we're going to see what kind of ideas they were the first to really develop and profoundly change society with their energetic ideas being imposed or implemented in the different societies. So, first guy we're going to talk about is Thomas Hobbes. Now, within the concepts of natural liberties, there ought to be certain liberties enjoyed by everyone simply because they're a human being. Why should a king be allowed to talk when a peasant not be allowed to talk? Everyone ought to have an opportunity to say something simply because they are alive, they have a mind, and therefore they are able to think, and therefore they are able to contribute to the conversation. Now, while everyone ought to have these rights, we have people going around trying to deny them their rights by using the force of government. Thomas Hobbes wrote a book called Leviathan where he said that the only way that we can guarantee these certain ideas of natural rights is that we have an absolute monarch with absolute power who will absolutely protect these ideas of natural rights. Essentially, he said that a group of people or a mob or where we have tried to have cooperation amongst peoples, that many times cooperation will be used against people's opportunities to exercise their natural rights of freedom of expression. Another guy we're going to take a look at on slide number 3 is John Locke. John Locke wrote the two treatises of government, where the idea that we have thousands, millions of people in a certain sovereign territory. We have a very small number of people who actually rule or run the government. Therefore, that the people who are the thousands and millions voluntarily subject themselves to the leadership and governing power of the ruling person or persons. And he said that what we have is people realize that the necessary organization that society needs is provided by government, and people will allow themselves to be ruled by them, and that this was a social contract, and that if the governors or the governing power abuses their position, then it is to the people, to the millions or the thousands, to overrule the few by kicking them out of office. You can do it violently or non-violently, but that they have the obligation in order to make sure that their own society is being run as they see fit and as they're willing to underput themselves. A couple of other guys, French philosophers, Baron Montesquieu said that the powers of government ought to be separated, because if you have one person who writes the laws, executes the laws, and then punishes people for the laws, means that they can do anything that they want. But if we separate those powers, then we have a check against impulsiveness of one person, and to make sure that those things are done fairly and with consistency. We also have a guy by the name of Rousseau, who wrote that people can be perfect. And since people can be perfect, we can then have a society where people will act perfectly. Now, we have a problem with this in Christianity, mainly because we know that man cannot be perfect because of the sin of nature. But Rousseau essentially was disagreeing with that concept and said that as people learn to be perfect, then we no longer have a need for government. Another guy that we're going to run into is by the name of Voltaire. And Voltaire essentially said that it's really unfair and unjust that we have to listen to religious people because all they're doing is putting onto us our fantasies. Voltaire obviously was not someone who was a very favorite person of Christians. The last guy we're going to talk about is the name Adam Smith, who wrote the book called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. However, pretty much everyone in the known universe just say the book is called The Wealth of Nations. And he wrote, in fact, he published in 1776 after he had some help from a certain American philosopher by the name of Ben Franklin, who had helped with some of his research. He wrote that individuals are capable of making their own decisions of what to produce, when to produce it, and how much to produce, and also who gets it when they're done. And that mercantilism, where most of these decisions were being made by the king, did not need to be doing that because of what he called the invisible hand. Now, if you ever want to read The Wealth of Nations, the book is over 1,000 pages long. And when I heard about it in high school and heard about the invisible hand, and I decided I was going to read this book, I was looking for invisible hand all over the place. It's only mentioned one place in the page 700s. However, what Adam Smith advocated in his idea was the idea of laissez-faire economics. The government does not need to be involved in what is being produced. People will produce because they need to provide for themselves. They're not going to produce stuff that other people don't want. And so they are going to produce things that people do want so that they can make that exchange so that so the people that are producing can also have other goods that they need as well. And so their own selfish decisions will provide for the society as a whole. And so the government does not need to make those decisions. Of course, one of those things or ideas that we can take a look at even into modern society is that we don't need the central government making all of the decisions, because if those central decision makers make a singular mistake, then everything gets messed up. Whereas if individuals are making the decision, yeah, an individual might lose their job or an individual might lose their business, but it's still the society is able to provide for itself. Of course, that's why autocratic communism does not work, because that's where the central decision makers make all those mistakes. Not because that they are dumb and stupid, it's just that it's impossible to predict the needs of an economy from a central location where you don't know everybody's individual needs, wants, desires. So that's one thing of why Adam Smith's ideas tend to work and Karl Marx does not. This concludes discussion number 1, Famous Thinkers of the Enlightenment, of Chapter 5, The Enlightenment and Revolution.